Good morning, and let's get this show on the road. I didn't think last week that I would be doing something like this, but life changes everything. Um, I guess when I say good morning, to make those of you in the first period class feel comfortable, I should say, you should have reminded me to turn in attendance. And my standard opening for third period is that the final beep? So now, if you feel comfortable, let's talk a little bit about poetry. I gave you an assignment to go over the definitions, but I think you all know that definitions are really not what poetry is all about. So I'm hoping to go through some poems and make the material more familiar to you. Now, I know your big question is probably, well, what about the test? That seems to be always the question. Anyway, I haven't made out the test, of course, but it will involve definitions in some way or other. Also, probably some examples, and then I will ask you to say what piece of figurative language is being used here. And then I will maybe have you identify some poems. If you've looked through the syllabus that I just sent you, you'll notice that I've included a number of poems that we had from first semester from the British Lit, and I really hope that that will come back to you. But I will go through them because I want you to be comfortable with the poetry, and of course, as all English teachers strive to do, try to make you love poetry the way we do. This is not the ideal way to do it, although on the other hand, welcome to my world. This is the little reading room in our monastery library, and I am the librarian. Haven't been doing much in the library lately because learning how to use RenWeb and making mistakes has taken a lot of time. Anyway, looking at the syllabus here, I noticed that in chapter 5 with figurative language, simile I think you're all familiar with, even from grade school, a comparison using like or as. My love is like a red, red rose, as Robert Burns said. Metaphor, the road was a ribbon of moonlight. Well, we all know the road is not a ribbon of moonlight, but it makes it very vivid for us. Now, personification, the wind howled through all hours of the night, giving human qualities to something that is non-human or that is perhaps, non-human, abstract, usually something abstract. Now, apostrophe, which you all seem to persist in forgetting, is to greet someone. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, or Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour, and so on. Now, the two that you're a little less familiar with are metonymy and synecdoche. Now, remember, metonymy is the use of something closely associated to signify something else. Remember, we usually say the Vatican announced, and we really mean that the Pope announced, or the White House, meaning the president. If you said someone, let's see, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Metonymy. The ones I use are the ones I usually use. But do you remember in Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour? We talked about altar, sword, and pen. And altar is so closely associated with the church that it signifies the church. Sword, the military, and pen, literature. They gave an example from Terence, This Is Stupid Stuff, but I can't really remember it right now. But now, as far as synecdoche, that means using a part of the thing for the whole. I've always used just things like all hands on deck. I've got my eye on you. You know, the synecdoche, it's part of the thing. In Terence, This Is Stupid Stuff, he says, Moult does more than Milton can to justify the ways of God to man. Well, malt is actually an ingredient of liquor. So that would be a synecdoche for liquor, beer in particular. And let's see, I have a couple of poems here. One is Metaphors on 738. And if you would get that open, Sylvia Plath, very interesting writer. She had great promise as a young person, She's probably best known for her poem Daddy, where she speaks out with really vitriolic passion against her father. Well, what did he do to her? Well, he died, and that's something that she never could forgive him for. She was somewhat mentally unstable, and she has a poem called Lady Lazarus, which describes what happened when she was a very young person, or a young woman, and she crawled under the house to die. And she said when they finally found her and pulled her out, they picked the worms off like sticky pearls. That's an image that will stay with you. She married an English poet and eventually committed suicide. Her two children were in the house, and she used the gas oven, and sadly died because she was a brilliant poet. But one of the happy times in her life seemed to be when she was pregnant. And she has two poems I particularly like. This one, Metaphors, and she has another one that if I can find it, I'll come up with it. But if you look at Metaphors on 738, the whole poem is a riddle of metaphors. I'm a riddle in 9 syllables. An elephant, a ponderous house, a melon strolling on 2 tendrils. O red fruit, ivory, fine timbers. This loaf's big with its yeasty rising. Money's new minted in this fat purse. I'm a means, a stage, a cow and calf. I've eaten a bag of green apples. Boarded the train, there's no getting off. It's not always very clear to people that this is someone who is pregnant. And when she says, I'm a riddle in 9 syllables, that might give you a clue. And a pregnant lady might feel like an elephant, a ponderous house. That sense of ponder is to weigh, and she just feels like an elephant and very heavy. The next line is really kind of amusing, a melon strolling on 2 tendrils, because sometimes if a lady is so pregnant that her legs look very small, she does look like a melon strolling on 2 tendrils. And then very beautifully, O red fruit, the baby in her womb, ivory, the bones and the fine timbers. This loaf's big with its yeasty risings. One of the slang ways of saying someone was pregnant was to say she had a bun in the oven. Well, she's talking about as a loaf with its yeasty rising. Money's new minted in this fat purse. Her uterus is creating new money, a new baby. I'm a means. Well, having the baby is a means to an end, a stage. Creating the baby is a stage in the process, a cow and calf. I've eaten a bag of green apples. If you eat green apples, you can have a big tummy ache, and it can make your tummy swell. And the last line, boarded the train, there's no getting off. I mean, she's going to have to carry that through to the end of the pregnancy. But I think it's a very lighthearted and delightful poem. And did you notice that it's in 9 lines, if you just count them there? So it's a very clever little poem. And she has another one that someone said, oh, it's about a tumbler, and it really wasn't. Okay, now I also marked down here a valediction forbidding mourning on 742. You may remember we had that from John Donne, and it's in several sections, really. If you go over it, I hope it'll come back to you. And then if you read the questions, that should be helpful. A valediction, as I told you, is a word diction, dicta, telling you valet, hail. You have a valedictorian who gives the final goodbye speech for the class. And this is when he's giving a goodbye speech to his wife and asking her not to grieve. It's a very tender poem. You may remember that John Donne lived in the 16th and part of the 17th century and was the big daddy of the metaphysical movement. And the word we often associate there is conceits. A conceit is an extended metaphor. And in this one, the famous conceit is always the compass, that just as they're like 2 legs of a compass, when he goes away, she keeps him steady, and eventually he will come back to her. I'm rather partial to the other one in here, where he says, our love is like a a lump of gold, and when we're separated, the gold isn't broken in two, but the gold is hammered so fine that it creates a link between us. Now, in the first verses, he's asking her not to get all upset because they're parting. In the first verse, he said, when good men die, they die so peacefully and so gently that people can't tell for sure when the breath has stopped. In the second verse, he says, let's do the same thing. Don't have tear floods or sigh tempests, because it would be exposing their sacred love to lesser people, to a profanation of our joys, to tell the laity our love. Profanation has to do with church things, like if you put beer in the chalice, that would profane it. And the laity, of course, are those who are not ordained. But their love is so special that to let other people see it, if she gets all upset, would be to profane it. And he says in the third verse that great earthquakes in the planets are more significant, or more, well, they are more powerful than earthquakes on Earth, but here on Earth, they don't bother us. Now, the fourth verse, he said, ordinary lovers, dull sublunary, those who live under the moon, their whole love is based on sense, and they can't allow absence because it removes the thing which elemented it. You know, there's an old song, if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with, which is an awful sentiment. But they also, he's saying, ordinary lovers can't bear to be apart, but we, by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is. Enter assured of the mind, because we are one mind and one heart, we care less eyes, lips, and hands to miss. And then he gives the image I like so much. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. Well, that image may not have impressed her enough, so then he says, if they are two so, as stiff twin compasses are two, thy soul the fixed foot makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. And though it in the center sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. It's a beautiful love poem, but not in the typical way. And this is part of the metaphysical genius, that they use images from all kinds of areas, astronomy, physics, war, everything like that. Now, he wasn't leaving because he wanted to, but he had to earn a living, and he was acting as a secretary for some great person. Keep in mind, too, that the North Sea, which the British would cross to get to the continent, Germany, Netherlands, and so on, could be very, very erratic, and certainly boats sank in it. One of Gerard Manley Hopkins' great poems, The Wreck of the Deutschland, is about just such a boat going down. So anytime people went out on ships in those days, it was difficult because of the dangers and the fact that their boats were so kind of rickety. You know, you've seen pictures of the boats, and I don't know if we would want to cross the channel in one of them. Now, the other poem, To His Coy Mistress, and remember, coy means hard to get. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but if you look at it on 744, remember I pointed out to you that it's kind of in three paragraphs, each one indented, and in the first section, he makes his claim and says that if they had unending time, he would spend it praising her because she is so wonderful. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower rate. The fact is, though, we don't have all the time in the world. And then a famous line, at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. Now, that little stroke in winged means you don't pronounce it winged, you pronounce it winged. And that gives a sense of being, kind of crowded in time. At my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. Time goes fast, Now, I don't know if you feel this way after being sort of in quarantine for the past couple of weeks. I find myself in a sort of a different state, but I don't know about you. But he says, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. In other words, life is short and death is long. And once you die, you won't be beautiful. Worms are going to get you. And he says the grave's a great place for privacy, but no one wants to go there to make love. And then the next section, because it is an argument, if we had all the time in the world, I would spend centuries until the resurrection of the dead, from the flood till the resurrection of the dead, praising you. But time goes quickly, we'll be dead a long time. Now, therefore. So essentially, he's saying what the slang in my day was, let's get it on. Now, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, now let us sport us while we may. It is a seduction poem. He's trying to get the girl to go to bed with him. Like amorous birds of prey. The imagery here, I find more and more off-putting as I get older. Amorous birds of prey. Of course, birds of prey are those who eat other little critters live. Rather at once our time devour. Birds of prey eating, devour. Eat up our time, then languish in his slow chapped power. Now, your chaps are your lips. He's saying instead of letting time gum us to death, let's devour our time. Rather at once our time devour, than languish in our slow chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Devour, birds of prey, tear, rough strife. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. And you may be reminded there that we say, how time flies when you're having fun. And it's not on your paper, but the next one, Introduction to Poetry, I took with you. This was Billy Collins saying, why don't we just enjoy poetry? You may remember I told you that poetry is sometimes identified as hyacinths and biscuits by Sandburg, or a poem should not mean but be. And one of my favorite ones by Marianne Moore, where she says it's an imaginary garden with real toads. But probably, ideally you read a poem and it just kind of sinks in, or you absorb it, or part of you responds to it. But like most English teachers, I'm doing what Billy Collins says we shouldn't. He says, I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. In other words, just savor, delight in the poem. But all they want to do, and we're responsible for this, we teachers, is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with the hose to find out what it really means. And I'm not sure that that's such a bad thing. Initially, you kind of have to learn how to look at poems, how to examine the depths of the poems in order to, I would suppose, later be able to read for that sheer delight that, and I hope when I sent you the poems by Mary Collins, and I hope that you found some delight in those. What are you going to do with your one wild, splendid life, or something like that? All right, now, chapter 6, Symbol and Allegory. Well, I think you know what symbol is. It says something that means more than what it is. And in The Road Not Taken, you definitely see the two roads. The person talks about choosing one. Now, someone said later that Frost was a little embarrassed by this poem. And he said someone else had given him the idea, that it was really the other person's life. But his biographers aren't so sure of it. But I think it's a very sad situation if you go through life doing one thing and then you keep thinking, well, maybe I should have done something else. Now, I hope you read through this and know what it's about. I didn't ask you to do the other questions, but I did. Right now, I'm looking at 753 Digging by Seamus Heaney. Well, I'm not doing this just because he's Irish, but he did win the Nobel Prize, as William Butler Yeats did. Now, I like Heaney very much. Sometimes in Ireland we say Haney, sometimes Heaney. And the part of the country my grandparents came from, they said Haney, but I think most people say Heaney. And he's from the north of Ireland, and he wrote about the terrible things that happened there during what we call the Troubles, when English people, England had to send people in to keep the peace between the Northern Ireland Catholics and Protestants. And eventually the Provisional IRA got going, and they and the Ulster Defence Force committed all kinds of atrocities. And Haney lived up in the north of Ireland. He grew up in that, though as a Catholic in Donegal. He eventually left, and he lectured at places like Harvard and that. But when you get the Nobel Prize, it's not just for writing great stuff. There has to be a political element in it. I say political, I mean cultural or that. You know, William Butler Yeats wrote about the Rising. Remember we had Easter 1916? All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. And he wrote about the Irish Civil War. So he was, even though he could seem very spacey at times, he was plugged into what was going on. And Seamus Heaney actually got the prize because he too wrote about a particular situation. Robert Frost never got the Nobel Prize, which always made him angry. But you see, he wrote about New England and New England life, and his work has great depth to it if you really look into it, and expresses, a great deal of human emotion. People think of him as just a cheerful farmer, and he liked to project that image. But actually, Robert Frost was a very complex person, and we may get around to that sometime. But in this one, Digging, Seamus Heaney has an image. His father is with him in his house, and his father is digging flower beds for him. His father had a farm and worked very hard. Beautiful poem, too, about plowing. And there was a great deal of affection between them. But in this poem, he has kind of a powerful image in the first verse. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Well, snug as a gun, that's a simile that really gives us pause. But then we remember that many great uprisings were started with pamphlets, with writing. We say the pen is mightier than the sword. But then the scene changes. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills when he was digging. You know, Heaney's mind goes back to when his father was in fact a farmer, digging potato drills. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft, against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edges deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, leaving their cool hardness in our hands. I know a little bit about potatoes because when I was growing up, the Flahertys, who lived across the road from us, had a father from the west of Ireland, and he actually grew potatoes. They had lovely flowers initially, and what you had to do, though, was go and dig off the drills and sort of put the potatoes deeper so they would fatten up. But some of the baby potatoes were left, and we called these new potatoes, and they tasted very, very good. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. And then he thinks about his grandfather doing the same kind of manual labor with the spade. I also know about turf, because Mr. Flaherty had what we called a bog up in the Dublin Mountains, and he would dig out the turf, stack it to dry, and eventually bring it back to our neighborhood in the suburbs and use it in place of coal. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away. Wasn't going to waste any time. Nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sod over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, we're going back to his father digging the potatoes, the squelch and slap of soggy peat. Isn't that great, all that alliteration? The squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge. Through living roots to awaken in my head, let me try that again. The curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head, but I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. He's not a person who's farming or doing hard labor, but with his pen, he will create. He will make something worthwhile. It's a wonderful poem, and as you can see, I like it very much. This, on 756, we also have To the Virgins, To Make Much of Time. And you may remember that, gather ye rosebuds while you may. Old time is still a-flying. Basically, he's encouraging young women to get married as soon as they can while they're still young and fairly good-looking. It's a carpe diem poem, as indeed was To His Coy Mistress, Seize the Day. That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent, the worse and worst times still succeed the former. Well, I could make an argument with that because as you get older, things can get better. But he says, get married as fast as you can. And allegory, gathering rosebuds, allegory is telling a story on one level and meaning something else. I think one of the easiest ways to remember this is probably the parables of Jesus. You know, when he tells about the prodigal son, or when he talks about the Good Samaritan, he's really telling us something else. In the parable of the prodigal son, that God accepts us back in spite of our ingratitude and our misdemeanors and so on. In the Good Samaritan, telling us how we should love our neighbors as ourselves. Okay, so symbol and allegory, and I see here we have Ulysses. Okay. 768. But before we get to that, would you look at Fire and Ice on page 761? This is by Robert Frost. Marvelous poem. But one of the notes I came across this time that I didn't know before has to do with the first two lines. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. And apparently scientists have made various predictions about how the world will end, most of them involving either a fiery or an icy terminus. At the time he published the poem in 1920, the two leading theories were A, that as the Earth gradually loses momentum in its orbit, it will be drawn by gravity closer and closer to the sun, until finally it plunges into the sun. And of course it'll end in fire. And that as the sun gradually cools, or as the interior of the Earth itself cools, the Earth will get colder and colder until finally all life is extinguished in a new ice age. Both theories still have many supporters. I think Frost would be surprised 100 years later to find that we have different theories today. You know, T.S. Eliot at the end of The Hollow Man says, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. Not with a bang, you know, he would have been concerned about war, and then later people were concerned about nuclear power. But with a whimper, right now we're dealing with the coronavirus, which seems to be pretty lethal, and we're also dealing with climate change. So between germs and rising seas and other things, we're not really thinking fire and ice. But the deeper meaning has to do with the fire within us, the passion, and the ice, the hatred that we can cause. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. Desire can cause all kinds of upheaval and wanton murders and so on. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. So you have the two extremes there. Unmoderated desire can be a cause of taking life, and hatred can be a cause of taking life. It's a very short poem, one that has a lot of application to us in our living. And then Ulysses, you may remember, and I'm looking here to see. I'm not going to take the poem Weighing the Dog, but I like the thought of it, because when I used to take my dogs to Dr. Haynes, as I told you, he would step on the scale and weigh himself, and then pick up the dog and weigh the two of them and then subtract. But we will look at Ulysses, and you may remember that Ulysses was one of the people at the Battle of Troy, and he took about 20 years to get home, partly because he had offended the Cyclops, and the father of the Cyclops, Neptune, made life difficult for him. But in the poem, it's very realistic, but he says that it's very hard for him to come back from traveling and adventure and just try to rule these kind of wild people. They don't really know him, and it's very hard for him to just settle down. Well, sometimes retired people feel this way, and they start a second career. He said, life piled on life were all too little, and of one little remains. But every hour is saved from that eternal silence, something more, a bringer of new things. And you have to admire that in older people who still have a sense of adventure. In the second section, he talks about how much he admires his son, who has gifts that Ulysses doesn't have. Telemachus has the patience to rule the people and try to make them civilized. He works his work, I mine. I guess I've always liked that, because sometimes parents feel very upset if their children don't do what they did. But Ulysses says, hey, my son has his gifts, and that's fine. And then the last section, there lies the port, the vessel puffs her sail, and you can feel his excitement. You and I are old age had yet his honor and his toil, death closes all. But something before the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not on becoming men that strove with gods. And then he says, push off, and for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. Those of us who are older often have this in mind. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts. Yes, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. In many ways, there's a lot of defiance in this poem, which is, as it were, a dramatic monologue. You know, there's a speaker, a situation, and someone listening. And it seems to be that he's talking to his mariners. But even at your age, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. And early on, he talks about to follow knowledge like a sinking star. And we want you to do that too. Okay, well, I think that pretty much covers chapters, let's see, 5 and 6. And that's enough for today. So I'll close and see if this really did, see if it really did record. Okay.